So far in the lectures we've discussed microevolution, that's small-scale evolution at the population level. We've talked about evidence for evolution and how Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, the theory of natural selection. And we've also looked at how we classify organisms based on evolution. And lastly, we want to talk about macroevolution. That's bigger evolutionary change from the microevolution scale. So that's what we'll do today. Now, we can see examples of this in the work on the Galapagos that Darwin and others have done. When you go off the coast of South America to the Galapagos Islands, you will find these islands have interesting species there that are not found anywhere else. There is a cormorant, for example, that we see right here. Many of you who are from this area are probably familiar with cormorants. They live on Lake Conway during certain times of the year, and they eat fish. They fly all over the place. You'll see them perched all over the trees. Well, there's a form of cormorant on the Galapagos that can't fly. It's a flightless cormorant. Like, how did it get there? Well, it probably evolved from ancestors that could fly, that live on the mainland, that washed out or blew out or flew out to the Galapagos at some point. That's how we explain it through this process of evolution. But this is a different species from the cormorant found on the mainland now. There's also tortoises, big tortoises found on the Galapagos Island that are found nowhere else in the world. They evolved there from an ancestor on the mainland. We can see the evidence of this, right? So, speciation. This chapter focuses on speciation, but this could be even higher level evolution like new phyla, new kingdoms and things, right? Speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more species. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. You have one species. You can think of it like sister taxa on a cladogram. One species splits into two. So you had one, it split into two, right? When one species splits, the species that result share many characteristics inherited from their common ancestor, right? So here's species 1, it splits into species 2 and 3, right? Or it could be that species 1 gives rise to species, here's species 1 and here's species 2, and species 1 gave rise to species 2, but species 1 still exists. That's also possible, okay? So, obviously, these two organisms are going to have lots of traits that are similar, lots of inherited traits that are similar if they are closely related, if they're sister taxa. So this is kind of a bridge. This idea of speciation is kind of between micro and macroevolution. Macroevolution is big-scale evolution. Microevolution is that evolution of populations. So microevolution is like the change in allele frequency over time. Macroevolution is kind of what we saw in the phylogeny chapter. Big, broad patterns of evolutionary change, usually above or at sometimes the species level. So new families of organisms, new classes of organisms, new genre of organisms, things like that. So it says, for example, new groups of mammals would be an example of macroevolution. So speciation is kind of at that border between micro and macro. Now, what is a species? And notice I say species. Singular is species, plural is also species. Never say species. That's not a scientific term. Species is an old pirate word for a coin. like I have a pocket full of coins. So, for now, we're going to use the biological species concept as our way of defining species. Okay? Biological species concept. The biological species concept states that when organisms that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring, if two organisms can do that, then they're considered part of the same species. So, if organism A plus organism B, like yields another organism, right? And that organism itself is viable, meaning it's alive, and fertile, meaning it can have its own babies, then A and B are considered the same species. They gave rise to a viable offspring that could survive and could have its own babies. Okay. So when you have a horse giving rise to a mule, so when a horse and a donkey have a baby, and they give rise to a mule, that mule is viable, meaning it's alive, but typically it's not fertile. So a horse and a donkey are considered separate species. They can have babies, but those babies are not fertile. That's the biological species concept. And what we should note is that a lot of, at least from our perspective, a lot of species look similar that are actually different species. And we as humans often like to think of our own species as being very different, but we're all the same species. We can all interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So just how things look are not always good tests for what species things are, or whether they're the same or a different species. We have to rely on cladistics to help us out with that. So one thing I want to point out is that the biological species concept relies on reproductive isolation in its definition, meaning no gene flow. That should be a term you know. So if organism A cannot share genes with organism B, then they are different species. If there's no gene flow possible between these two organisms, they are different species. And this is going to rely on pre- or post-zygotic barriers. Let's define that. Zygotic means zygote. So a pre-zygotic barrier would mean two organisms do not mate. Right? A post-zygotic barrier would mean they do mate and make a zygote, but it's either not fertile or it's not viable. Okay? So this is the most common species concept that we typically use, so that's the one that we'll use when we're talking about species for the most part. But the biological species concept has some severe limitations. This will probably come up again later, but it doesn't work with fossils because they're dead. You can't see if they can make babies, right? It doesn't work with asexual organisms like bacteria. It has other limitations as well, but those are a few of its limitations. And sometimes things can hybridize. Which makes it confusing as to what is and what is not a species. So just in a nutshell though, what is the biological species concept? It means that one species cannot reproduce successfully with another. So if you have two critters and they can't make babies together, you can consider them different species. Okay. And when I use the word hybrid, I mean a cross between two different species. Usually one of them is sterile, but not always. That's when it gets complicated. All right, so I'm going to start talking about the different barriers between species in the next video. But remember, it's all about reproductive isolation. The stopping of the flow of genes from one species to another. That's how we define a biological species, if they cannot breed successfully.